In this lecture, I'll be talking about 3 historical examples of crucial experiments. Now, a crucial experiment is an experiment in which is an experiment that allows a scientist to sort of conclusively decide between 2 competing hypotheses. So the crucial experiments we're going to talk about today span a number of centuries and a number of disciplines. The first crucial experiment I'll be talking about involves magnetism. Now, Robert Norman was a 16th century English instrument maker for the Navy. He built various kinds of instruments for navigation, and in particular, he worked with compasses. So he's an expert compass builder. And Norman was, in addition to being a sort of practical engineer, Norman was very interested in how his compasses worked. And therefore, he was very interested in magnetism. And he wrote a lot about magnetism and a lot about magnets, lodestones in the parlance of the time. Now, Norman didn't discover this phenomena, but one of the phenomena he was interested in was called magnetic dip. And what this is that in addition to when you build a compass and you magnetize a needle, in addition to the compass needle facing north, the part of the needle that faces north also dips down a little bit. So the needle turns and then it dips a little bit. And instrument makers and what we'd call now scientists of the time were very interested in this phenomena of magnetic dip. And so they designed an instrument called a dip circle that allowed them to measure magnetic dip. And this little diagram shows a dip circle. All it basically was the compass was set in a sort of rounded bowl that allowed you to mark off or measure both the degree to which, the direction to which the needle turned and also the degree to which it dipped. And now Norman determined that the dip was not caused by the end of the needle taking on any extra weight. Okay, so he did measurements that determined that the needle doesn't get any heavier where it dips. So it's not just that the north-facing needle gets heavier and that causes it to dip. And so Norman, who again was very interested in the phenomena of magnetism in general and how magnets worked, realized that he could use this phenomena of dip to help him decide between 2 sort of competing hypotheses about how compasses worked. And in addition to how compasses worked, what magnetism was, how magnetism worked in the world. And these 2 hypotheses were what you might call the attraction hypothesis and the field hypothesis. The attraction hypothesis is that the compass needle is attracted to something. Something is pulling it in a northward direction. If something is pulling it in a northward direction, presumably something is also pulling it in a northward and somewhat downward direction, causing the dip. Now the other theory, and this was the theory that Norman thought was likely the case, was that the compass needle moves as a result of a field of force. That is, nothing is pulling it, but it exists within a field of force that's not attracting it in any particular direction, but that's just causing it to move. So Norman realized that the phenomena of magnetic dip would allow him to design a crucial experiment between these 2 hypotheses, at least given the information he had in his day. And so what he did was he found a goblet, and he took a needle, one of his, a compass needle, and a piece of cork, and some water. So using just a goblet and some water, and a compass needle, and a piece of cork and a lodestone, he was able to decide between these 2 hypotheses. And here's what he did. Here you see the goblet, and the little round thing in the center of the goblet is a piece of cork. So what he did was he took a needle and he stuck it through a piece of cork, and then he magnetized it. So essentially he had a compass floating in water. Okay, so it faced northward, and it dipped down a little bit. And then he carefully trimmed the needle he carefully trimmed the cork around the needle so that it would dip down into the water. It would decline into the water, so it was submerged. And then he took it out and he magnetized it again. And he put it back in so that it was still suspended in the water. And it turned north and it dipped. But it didn't, when it dipped, it wasn't dragged down to the bottom of the cup. And this seemed to show, at least given the information they had at the time, this seemed to demonstrate that the field concept was correct rather than the attraction concept. Because if the needle was being attracted to something, it should have been pulled down to the bottom of the cup. But it wasn't. It turned northward and it dipped, but it dipped in place and it wasn't pulled down to the bottom of the cup. And therefore, at least at the time, this seemed to be conclusive evidence that it was a field of force causing compass needles to move rather than an attraction. Now, the actual story is a bit more complicated than that, as we discovered and scientists discovered in the years that followed. But this crucial experiment was important because it provided good evidence that fields of force had something to do with magnetism, and that ended up being an extremely productive insight in the study of magnetism. Okay, so now fast forwarding a couple centuries to the 18th century, Stephen Hales was a biological researcher who was particularly interested in the question of circulation. He was interested in circulation both in animals and in plants. And today we're going to talk about an experiment that he did to determine exactly how sap circulates through plants. Now, there's two competing hypotheses on how sap circulates through plants. The first is that fluids circulate through plants as in animals. Now, they knew, at least in part because of Hales's experiments Hales had done, how blood circulates through animals and the role of the heart in circulation. And so the question was then, do fluids circulate through plants as in animals? Or do fluids just sort of ebb and flow through the plants like the tides? Now, and so these were the two competing theories. There was the circulation theory and the ebb and flow theory. Now, the circulation theory there were actually two possibilities with the circulation theory. So if you look, these are my lovely drawings of three trees. One possibility was that sap circulated up the outside of the plant like this, and then went down the middle. A second circulation theory was that it might go up the middle of the plant and then down the outside. And then the ebb and flow theory was that it just sort of goes up throughout the plant, and then it sort of goes down throughout the plant all at once. Okay, so now the way that Hales figured out he could test this hypothesis was this. He took a plant and so this is it probably didn't look exactly like this, but basically what he did was he took a stick and he whittled off one end of the stick so that all of the outer portion, only the inner core of that stick was exposed. He cut out all of the outside or outer rings of the plant. And then up farther on the stick, he cut out just, you can see here, he cut out just the tiniest bit of the core, of the outside of the bark, so that the innermost, one of the outermost rings was exposed here. And then he put the water, he put this end, the core end, into water, so that the only way water could circulate up through the stick was through the core. And now this would allow him to test between any of these three possibilities. Because let's look at what happens. Well, if the sap, if fluid circulates through the plant through the outer portion of the plant and then goes down through the middle portion of the plant, well then the outer portion of the plant has been whittled away. So there would be, if this is the case, there would be nothing to take in the water. And so what would happen if this was the correct model for how sap circulates would be that no water would go up into the stick, and this patch would remain completely dry because no water would be going up no water would be able to go up the outside at all. Now, if this middle possibility was the case, where water goes up the middle and then down the outside, what should happen would be that, well, water can go up the middle here because the middle is still there, and then the water would go up in the plant. He actually had the rest of the plant at the end, so he hadn't cut off the end. So water would go up, all the way up into the plant, and then as it went back down, since it goes down through the outside, the top of this little patch would become wet before the lower portion would become wet. Because what would be happening would be the water would be going up the middle of the plant, then down the outside, and you'd be able to see it coming down the outside first in the top of this little patch. And then if the ebb and flow model was correct, what would happen would be the water can go up through any part of the plant and go down through any part of the plant. So what would happen in that case would be that the bottom of this patch would become wet first, because what would be happening was it would just ebb into the bottom here and then spread out because it goes through the whole plant, and the bottom of this patch would get wet first. So this clever little experiment, just this experiment with a stick and some water, is a nearly perfect crucial experiment between these three hypotheses. And it turned out that what happened was the ebb and flow model turned out to be correct. The bottom of the patch became wet first, which showed that water it doesn't circulate as it does through animals. It just sort of goes all the way up the plant all at once. Okay. So moving forward another century, now we're going to talk about animal ethnologist Konrad Lorenz. So Konrad Lorenz was an expert on animal ethnology, the study of animal behavior. So he was an expert on animal behavior, and he was in particular an expert on a phenomena called imprinting. Now some animals imprint on other animals to establish patterns of behavior. And what happens here is that mostly these are birds. So Lorenz and other animal ethnologists discovered that there's certain kinds of birds that don't innately recognize don't seem to innately recognize members of their own species. What they do is they hatch, and the first thing they see, they imprint upon. That is, normally in the wild, the first thing they're going to see is Mother Goose, right? And so they're going to imprint on Mother Goose, and they're going to treat Mother Goose as mom. But if that gets disturbed, as if, for example, an animal ethnologist named Konrad Lorenz is the first being they see upon hatching, then this type of geese, for instance, gray-lag geese, will imprint on Konrad Lorenz and think Konrad Lorenz is mommy and follow Konrad Lorenz around, as you see in this picture. This is one of the famous pictures of, well, insofar as there are famous pictures of animal ethnologists. This is the sort of the Konrad Lorenz picture with him wandering around with these geese following him around. And so now it's important to note about imprinting is that imprinting isn't, it's not learned behavior in the sense that we would understand learned behavior. The difference here is that it's not that the geese are hatched and infer that Konrad Lorenz is their mother and operate on the hypothesis that Konrad Lorenz is their mother until they have some reason to believe otherwise. It doesn't seem to be a belief. It seems to be just a behavior. Whatever they imprint on, they're just sort of stuck that way. They're going to keep behaving that way no matter what. It doesn't seem to be something they can unlearn. And so So Lorenz knew about imprinting, knew that imprinting was a phenomena, but there was sort of two competing hypotheses about the details of how imprinting worked. And one was that animals imprint for all behaviors at the same time. And so this hypothesis says that there's one special magical moment of imprinting, and that the animal will imprint at that point and imprint for all behaviors relevant to imprinting. The other hypothesis is that animals imprint different behaviors at different times. And this hypothesis would be that for various different kinds of behaviors that imprinting is relevant to, an animal will imprint at these different times. And the way that Lorenz decided among these competing hypotheses was he took a jackdaw, which is one of the birds that imprints, and it was exposed only to human beings, hooded crows, and other jackdaws. And it was exposed to these other animals at different times. They were able to monitor its behavior, and they found that it seemed to imprint to other jackdaws for mating because it was around other jackdaws at the time, apparently, in which imprinting for mating occurred. And so when it was time to mate, it looked for other jackdaws. But when it came to social flying in groups, it always, given the choice between jackdaws or hooded crows, it always flew with hooded crows. And this showed that the hypothesis that animals imprint at different times for different behaviors was the correct one, because this jackdaw obviously imprinted to jackdaws for mating behavior and to hooded crows for other types of behavior. So these are three little examples, three little historical examples of crucial experiments. So remember that what makes an experiment a crucial experiment is that it gives you good reason to choose one competing hypothesis over its competitors. So a crucial experiment is a sort of tiebreaker between competing hypotheses. And it's one very important tool in the scientist's arsenal for choosing among competing theories, along with other factors like simplicity and comprehensiveness and coherence.